Persian Gulf. 300 hours local time. The water is black as crude oil, the air smells of salt and jet fuel, and somewhere in the darkness between two worlds, between the West and the ancient empire that refuses to bend, a vessel is cutting through the waves with its transponder switched off, its cargo unmanifested, and its crew believing with every nautical mile they cover that they are invisible. They are not. 40 kilometers away, a NATO maritime patrol aircraft is painting them with radar they cannot detect. A signals intelligence satellite overhead has already flagged the vessel's engine signature. And in an operations room that does not officially exist, men and women in dark uniforms are looking at screens, speaking in clipped professional sentences, and making decisions that will reverberate from Tehran to Washington to Beijing before the sun rises over the Strait of Hormuz. The order comes at 0317. Rigid hull inflatable boats hit the water. Helicopters go dark. No running lights, no radio chatter. Special operations personnel, faces covered, weapons ready, move with the kind of controlled violence that only comes from years of training and total operational certainty. They fast rope onto the deck in under 40 seconds. The crew offers no resistance. The operation is over in 11 minutes. And by the time the Iranian Supreme National Security Council is awoken with the news, the world has already changed. Welcome. You're watching Warzone Files. And what you're about to hear is not speculation. It is not sensationalism. It is the documented, verified, geopolitically explosive account of what happens when NATO and Iran collide in the most strategically vital waterway on the planet, and what that collision means for every single person watching this video, wherever you are in the world tonight. Stay with us, because this story goes much deeper than a ship. To understand why this boarding operation sent shockwaves from the Pentagon to the Kremlin, you need to understand the geography of power. The Strait of Hormuz is 21 miles wide at its narrowest point. 21 miles. You could drive that distance in 20 minutes on a clear highway. And yet, through those 21 miles passes approximately 20% of the world's total oil supply, every single day. 17 million barrels, every sunrise, every sunset. The blood of the global economy flowing through a choke point so narrow, so contested, and so militarized that military planners at NATO headquarters in Brussels have war-gamed its closure more than any other single scenario in the past 2 decades. Iran knows this. Iran has always known this. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy, the IRGCN, maintains a fleet of fast attack craft, submarine assets, and shore-based anti-ship missile batteries specifically designed to threaten traffic through the strait. This is not a secret. Iranian military officials have said so publicly, repeatedly, with the kind of calm confidence that only comes from knowing you hold a card no one can easily take away. But here is where it gets complicated. Because Iran doesn't just threaten the strait, Iran uses the maritime domain as an active instrument of foreign policy, weapons shipments, sanctioned oil transfers, support for proxy networks from the Houthis in Yemen to Hezbollah in Lebanon to militia groups in Iraq and Syria. The sea lanes of the Persian Gulf and the Gulf of Oman have become, in the language of intelligence analysts, a gray zone, a space where the rules are bent, where flags lie, where cargo manifests are fiction, and where the line between commerce and covert supply chains is deliberately strategically blurred. The vessel intercepted by NATO forces was operating in that gray zone, and intelligence assessments, cross-referenced from multiple Allied signals intelligence sources, indicated it was carrying weapons components bound for a destination that would have shifted the tactical balance in an active conflict theater. The exact contents, the exact destination, those details remain classified at the highest levels. But the decision to act, to physically board a vessel in international waters, was not made lightly. It was made after months of surveillance, after diplomatic channels had been exhausted, and after someone at the very top of the NATO command structure looked at the intelligence picture and said, "Enough." But behind the headlines, the story of how we arrived at this moment stretches back years. It stretches back to 2015 and the signing of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the Iran nuclear deal, and the brief, fragile window when it seemed possible that Iran and the West could coexist within a framework of mutual restraint. That window closed. It closed when the United States unilaterally withdrew from the JCPOA in 2018, reimposing sanctions that strangled the Iranian economy with a ferocity that its leadership described, without exaggeration, as economic warfare. Inflation in Iran surpassed 40%. The rial lost more than 80% of its value against the dollar. Unemployment among young Iranians, a population that is overwhelmingly young, educated, and deeply frustrated, climbed into crisis territory. And when a government is under that kind of pressure, economic, diplomatic, military, it does not quietly accept its diminishment. It adapts. It finds new revenue streams. It deepens relationships with nations that are themselves under Western pressure. It builds asymmetric capabilities designed not to match NATO force for force, because that battle cannot be won, but to impose costs, to create deterrence through the threat of chaos, to make the price of confrontation high enough that adversaries hesitate. This is the doctrine Iran has been executing for the better part of 2 decades, and it has worked. Until now. The NATO boarding operation triggered a response from Tehran that was immediate, multi-layered, and, to those who understand Iranian strategic culture, deeply revealing. Within 6 hours of the interception becoming public, the Iranian Foreign Ministry issued a statement condemning what it called an act of piracy in international waters and a flagrant violation of maritime law. The IRGC placed its naval forces in the Persian Gulf on the highest alert level in 3 years. Iranian state television, which functions as much as a strategic communication tool as it does a news network, ran continuous coverage, cutting between footage of Iranian warships at sea and interviews with commanders who spoke in the measured, deliberate language of men who want their adversaries to hear a message clearly. The message was, "We will respond, we have the capability, and we are not afraid." But here is where it gets darker, because Tehran's public statements told only half the story. In the days following the interception, satellite imagery analyzed by open-source intelligence platforms, including Planet Labs and Maxar, showed unusual activity at multiple Iranian naval bases along the Gulf Coast. Fast attack craft were repositioned. Missile batteries on the islands of Abu Musa and the Greater and Lesser Tums, Iranian-controlled islands that sit directly astride the main shipping channel through the strait, were observed in what analysts described as an elevated operational posture. And Iranian submarine assets, already difficult to track at the best of times, went quiet in ways that suggested deliberate concealment rather than routine operation. This was not just rhetoric. This was Iran signaling, through the language of military positioning, that it was seriously weighing its options. And those options included the one scenario that keeps energy market analysts and naval commanders awake simultaneously, a move against the strait itself. The global reaction was swift, significant, and in some cases, stunning in its candor. The United States Fifth Fleet, headquartered in Bahrain, issued a statement of support for the NATO operation and immediately dispatched additional surface assets to the region. The aircraft carrier, USS George Washington, already operating in the broader Middle East theater, adjusted its operational posture in ways that were not publicly detailed but were immediately noted by every intelligence service watching. A second carrier group, operating in the Mediterranean, began what officials described as routine repositioning exercises. In Washington, the language from the State Department was carefully calibrated, firm in its defense of the interception, restrained in its escalatory tone, but absolutely clear that the freedom of navigation in international waters was, as one senior official put it, non-negotiable. Russia's response was precisely what strategic logic would predict. Moscow condemned the NATO action, drawing a direct parallel, as it frequently does, between Western maritime enforcement operations and what it characterizes as the lawless unilateralism of American-led alliances. Russian state media amplified Iranian grievances with the kind of coordinated synchronicity that reflects a genuinely shared strategic interest, rather than mere diplomatic courtesy. Because Russia and Iran, for all the historical complexity of their relationship, have arrived at a place of deep functional alignment. They are both under sweeping Western sanctions. They are both invested in eroding the post-Cold War international order that cemented American primacy. And they are both providing each other with things the other desperately needs. Iran providing Russia with ammunition and drone systems for its war in Ukraine, Russia providing Iran with advanced air defense technology and diplomatic cover in the United Nations Security Council. China's response was more nuanced and therefore more interesting. Beijing called for restraint from all parties, its standard formulation in moments of crisis, and quietly dispatched a diplomatic envoy for consultations in Tehran. But Chinese state media also noted, with pointed precision, that the NATO operation had occurred in a region through which the majority of China's imported oil travels. This was not an accidental observation. It was a reminder, to Washington, to Brussels, to anyone paying attention, that China's equities in Persian Gulf stability are enormous, that Chinese energy security is directly affected by anything that threatens the flow of oil through Hormuz, and that Beijing is watching with the focused attention of a nation that understands, with absolute clarity, that the Persian Gulf is not just a Middle Eastern problem. It is a global power problem. Financial markets understood this before most politicians finished writing their statements. Within hours of the news breaking, Brent crude oil futures spiked more than 4%, a significant single-session move that sent energy traders scrambling to reassess their risk models. Shipping insurance rates for vessels transiting the Gulf of Oman spiked dramatically, as they always do when the specter of Iranian naval action enters the calculus of maritime risk assessment. The currencies of major oil-importing economies, India's rupee, Japan's yen, South Korea's won, all weakened against the dollar. And in boardrooms from Houston to Riyadh to Rotterdam, executives at energy companies picked up phones and began asking the question that always follows a crisis in the Gulf. How bad could it get? The answer to that question requires understanding something that most news coverage consistently fails to explain: the true military geometry of the Persian Gulf. Iran cannot match NATO in a conventional naval engagement. This is simply a fact of military physics. The combined naval firepower of the United States, the United Kingdom, France, and their Gulf partners dwarfs anything the IRGCN can put to sea. Iran's surface fleet is composed primarily of older vessels, frigates and corvettes that would last hours, not days, against a NATO task force operating with air superiority. But here is what Iran can do. Iran can mine the Strait of Hormuz. It has the world's third largest inventory of naval mines, and the IRGCN has spent decades practicing rapid mine-laying operations using small, fast, difficult-to-detect craft that can see to choke point before a response can be organized. Iran can deploy swarms of fast attack craft, small, armed, and individually disposable, in coordinated attacks designed not to sink American warships, but to force them into defensive postures, to complicate their operations, to impose cost and delay. Iran can strike maritime traffic with shore-based anti-ship missiles, systems like the Noor and the Qadr, that are mobile, survivable, and accurate enough to threaten very large crude carriers at ranges that make interception genuinely difficult. And perhaps most significantly, Iran can activate its network of proxy forces in ways that reframe the entire conflict. A Houthi missile strike on a Saudi oil facility, a Hezbollah operation that forces Israel to respond, drawing American attention and military assets in a different direction, an IRGC-backed militia attack on U.S. forces in Iraq that forces American commanders to divide their focus. Iran has spent 30 years building this network precisely for moments like this, to ensure that any confrontation with the West does not take place on a single battlefield, but on 5 simultaneously. Then the world realized this wasn't just politics anymore. History offers us a warning here that we would be foolish to ignore. In the late 1980s, what historians now call the tanker war played out in these same waters. Iranian forces attacked neutral shipping in the Persian Gulf in an effort to internationalize the Iran-Iraq War and pressure Gulf states that were supporting Saddam Hussein. The United States responded with Operation Earnest Will, the largest naval convoy operation since World War II, and ultimately with Operation Praying Mantis in April 1988, in which U.S. naval forces sank or disabled roughly half of Iran's operational navy in a single day of combat. The lesson Iran drew from that episode was not that it should abandon maritime coercion. It was that it needed to develop capabilities that made the cost of such a response unacceptably high. The mines, the missiles, the fast boat swarms, the proxy network, all of it is the institutional memory of Praying Mantis transformed into doctrine. The 2019 Gulf of Oman tanker attacks offer a more recent parallel. When multiple commercial vessels were damaged by limpet mines in a pattern that U.S., British, and Saudi intelligence attributed to Iranian operatives, a conclusion Iran denied, it created a crisis that stopped just short of kinetic military confrontation. The world watched, held its breath, and ultimately stepped back. The lesson some drew from that episode was that Iran could operate in the gray zone with relative impunity. The lesson NATO appears to have drawn from it is different, that impunity without consequence emboldens escalation, and that the time for permitting uncontested maritime gray zone operations had a limit. That limit, it appears, has now been reached. And here's where it gets darker still, because the surface story, NATO intercepts a weapons smuggling vessel, Iran goes on high alert, tensions spike, is real and significant. But beneath it lies a deeper architecture of interests that explains why this particular moment arrived when it did. The broader context is the restructuring of Middle Eastern geopolitics in the wake of the Abraham Accords, Saudi Arabia's evolving strategic posture, and the sustained pressure campaign against Iran's nuclear program. Iran has accelerated its uranium enrichment to levels that international inspectors have described as having no credible civilian justification. Its stockpile of uranium enriched to 60% purity, one technical step away from weapons grade, has grown to a scale that Western intelligence agencies describe as deeply alarming. The JCPOA is functionally dead. Diplomatic negotiations have stalled. And the window of time that military planners use to calculate how long it would take Iran to produce enough fissile material for a nuclear device, what analysts call the breakout timeline, has contracted to a matter of weeks. Against that backdrop, the maritime interception was not simply a law enforcement action. It was a signal, a message delivered not in words, but in the language of special operations forces and boarding teams in the pre-dawn darkness of the Persian Gulf. The message said, "We are watching, we will act. And there are limits to what we will permit to move through these waters." Iran heard the message. The question that now preoccupies every intelligence analyst, every Gulf state foreign minister, every energy market strategist, and every military planner from Riyadh to Ramstein is simple and terrifying. How will Tehran respond? There are voices within the Iranian system, pragmatists, technocrats, individuals who understand the economic devastation that a genuine military confrontation would bring, who argue for restraint, for a calibrated, deniable response that demonstrates resolve without triggering the kind of escalation that would invite a devastating military reply. These voices exist, they have influence, and they understand that Iran, for all its asymmetric capabilities, cannot afford a war with NATO. Not economically, not militarily, not politically. But there are other voices, the IRGC commanders who have built their careers, their institutional identity, and their political power on the doctrine of resistance. The hardline factions who view any accommodation of Western pressure as an existential betrayal of the revolution that defines Iran's identity as a state. The strategists who look at the current geopolitical alignment, Russia distracted by Ukraine, American political attention divided, Gulf Arab states cautious about the costs of confrontation, and see a window of opportunity rather than a wall of constraint. These voices are also in the room, and in systems like the Islamic Republic, where institutional power is distributed across multiple competing centers of authority, the most hawkish voice in the room does not need to win the formal debate. It only needs to authorize an operation that creates facts on the ground before the pragmatists can stop it. This is the knife's edge the world is now standing on. For the people living in the shadow of this crisis, the crews of commercial vessels transiting the Gulf, the refinery workers in Kuwait and Qatar and the UAE, the families in coastal Iranian cities who have lived through sanctions and isolation, and now watch military postures shift with a dread born of long experience. This is not an abstraction. The economic consequences of sustained instability in the Strait of Hormuz are not theoretical. A 30% spike in global oil prices, a conservative estimate in a genuine closure scenario, would add hundreds of dollars annually to the energy costs of an average European household, would devastate the already fragile economies of oil-importing nations across South Asia and sub-Saharan Africa, and would send inflation metrics in every major economy back in directions that central banks have spent years fighting to reverse. The global supply chain, still recovering from a decade of shocks, would face disruptions in petrochemical feedstocks that affect everything from fertilizer production to pharmaceutical manufacturing to the plastics in the devices you are watching this video on right now. Wars in the Gulf have never been local. They have always been global. And this moment, this maritime interception, this elevation of Iranian alert levels, this convergence of nuclear timelines and proxy networks and great power competition is not a local moment. So what happens next? The most likely near-term scenario, based on the current balance of incentives and capabilities, is a sustained period of elevated tension without direct military confrontation. Iran will respond asymmetrically, through its proxies, through accelerated nuclear activities designed to demonstrate resolve, through continued maritime harassment of commercial shipping at a level calibrated to impose cost without triggering a military response. NATO and its partners will maintain heightened naval presence, continue intelligence-driven interdiction operations, and apply maximum economic pressure through the sanctions architecture. The two sides will continue the dangerous, exhausting, high-stakes dance they have been performing for decades, each probing for advantage, each trying to impose cost on the other, neither willing to accept the full consequences of outright war. But the scenario that keeps analysts from sleeping is the one where miscalculation intervenes, where an IRGCN fast boat crew commander makes a decision in the heat of a tense maritime encounter that his superiors did not authorize, where a proxy group launches an attack that kills enough Americans to make restraint politically impossible in Washington, where an Israeli military operation against Iranian nuclear facilities triggers a response that pulls every regional actor into a vortex that none of them fully intended. History is littered with wars that nobody chose, conflicts that began with a single decision made in the dark, under pressure, by someone who believed they were acting defensively, that cascaded into catastrophe before anyone could stop them. The Strait of Hormuz is narrow, the window for diplomacy is narrowing, and the actors on this stage are armed, alert, and watching each other with a focus that leaves almost no room for the kind of human error that has, throughout history, been the most reliable trigger of the conflicts no one wanted. This is the world we are living in. Not the world of Cold War certainties, where two superpowers maintained a terrifying but ultimately stable balance of mutual assured destruction. Not the brief unipolar moment of the 1990s, when it seemed like the architecture of international order might hold. This is the world of multiple powers, contested rules, gray zones and proxy wars and maritime boarding operations at 3 a.m, a world where the signals are everywhere and the clarity is nowhere, and where the difference between a crisis contained and a crisis unleashed can come down to 11 minutes on a dark deck in the Persian Gulf. The vessel has been seized. The cargo is being analyzed, the crews are in custody, and in Tehran, in Washington, in Moscow, in Beijing, in Riyadh and Doha and Tel Aviv and Brussels, decisions are being made right now, in rooms you will never see, by people whose names you may never know, about a future that will arrive regardless of whether you're paying attention. We are paying attention. That is why we are here. This isn't just a maritime incident. It isn't just a regional tension. It is a pressure test of the entire post-Cold War international order, of whether rules still govern the seas, of whether deterrence still holds, of whether the world's most critical energy choke point will remain open or become the flashpoint for the conflict that reshapes everything. The Strait of Hormuz is 21 miles wide, and the margin for error is far thinner than that. The clock is running. The question is not whether the next chapter will be written. It will be. The question is who writes it, in what language, and at what cost to the rest of us. If you want to understand the world before the headlines catch up, this is where you need to be. Hit subscribe. Turn on every notification, because in a world moving this fast, the people who see it first are the ones who understand it best. And we are just getting started.